Hi there, and welcome to our part 3 of training for suicide risk assessment teams and school-based mental health providers. I hope if you're watching part 3, you have also watched part 1 and part 2, which talk about prevention and intervention. And this series follows our Virginia Suicide Prevention Guidelines that were adopted by the Board of Education in June of 2020. My name is Martha Montgomery, and I'm the school psychology specialist at the Office of Student Services in the Department of Education.
And I am Sarah Bazemore. I'm the school counseling specialist and student assistance systems coordinator here at the Office of Student Services. So we want to also just remind you, hopefully you've already heard this because you've watched part 1 and part 2, but when you see the pencil icon and the light bulb icon, those mean that there are some resources or example forms or templates that you might want to explore.
So today we're talking about postvention, and I really like this quote or saying that everyone will have a different journey. Postvention can look very different from school to school or from school division to school division. And what any of us can tell you that have gone through a postvention situation, the more planning ahead that you can do, the better prepared you are as a community to be able to manage what happens. Because as we can all attest, when you're in that moment, it's really difficult to address that stress head on and plan at the same time. So putting some thought into this process ahead of time is going to go a long way to a more efficient and caring response as a school community. So when we talk about postvention, the crisis team is really the one that's going to guide the school's response following a death by suicide. This is a multidisciplinary team that should have mental health providers within that team, and really are encouraged to collaborate with your local community providers, because what we know is when there's a death by suicide, it likely doesn't just affect the school community, but most times it largely affects the greater community. And we want to have a collaborative approach so that we're working with students. There's an easy flow from maybe school-based services to community-based services, what can be provided there. So we really want to keep those coordination efforts going in this process. The first thing that we're going to do in our crisis response is verify the facts. And part of that goes with confirming the death. And we don't want to share out information about how the manner of death was, unless we know that as factual. We're only communicating facts. We also want to make communication with a family. And we do have some great tools that were created or developed with the AFSP after a suicide, a toolkit for schools. They have some great resources for how to communicate with a family. And really, we don't want to bypass the family in this event. Even though they are definitely struggling in this situation, it's really imperative that we include their voice in however the school responds, because not only might they have other children within the school division, the student is going to have other peers and other family members, families affected by this. So it's really important to include their voice in whatever message is being sent through the school. Mm-hmm. We're also going to assess the impact. And when we talk about assessing the impact and response preparation, really what we're talking about is determining what students are going to be the most affected. So we want to support and monitor any students that we feel might be at higher risk for any type of crisis or mental health situation following this death. Next slide, please.
Yeah, before we skip to the next one,
Yeah.
I want to say something about confirming the death. And this is
Mhm.
not a fun thing to have to do, but like you said, it's just so vital. And one of the reasons is too, with social media, sometimes uh, false information can be shared. We all know this. And
Yeah.
so sometimes you might hear about a student death and social media might be saying that it has occurred, but maybe it hasn't. Maybe it is just a rumor. And so it's really important that before we communicate anything to staff, to families, to communities, that we have confirmed that the student has actually passed away. And the manner of death, whether it be, whatever the cause of the death might be, that is an important element of it. And making sure that, when you're communicating with the family, that you're talking about what they feel comfortable with you sharing out the larger community. Some families are not going to want it to be stated the manner of death. So that is their right. They might not want it shared at all that the student has passed away. And so we really need to have that conversation with families, because we want to make sure that we are protecting their rights and that they feel comfortable with whatever steps we're going to take.
Absolutely. Thanks for including that. And I think as part of that is, as our risk assessment or crisis team members, we need to really discuss that with our school staffs. We don't want our teachers to sort of flame the rumors. So we need to make sure that we're communicating with our staffs about the appropriate information that we're sharing with their peers, as well as with their students. And again, the after the suicide toolkit really includes some great ways to communicate with staff.
Yeah, it is that's an amazing resource. I highly encourage teams to check it out.
Yes. So we're identifying the students and staff needing support. Many of us have gone through this, and it's important not only to recognize maybe the most obvious siblings or friends of the deceased, but there are going to be other students that we wouldn't necessarily identify as being at high need. Maybe they had a family member who died by suicide that we were unaware of, and all of a sudden the student's in crisis. So I think just keeping that net wide and understanding that there might be students that we never suspected might come out of the woodwork, and we need to make sure that we have supports in place just to help them and to identify them. This goes for staff too. We know that staff respond to suicide, death in very different ways. And again, there might be a history that we are unaware of, and this is going to create a crisis in their world. And we need to be very cognizant and responsive to that. We want to coordinate our support services. And again, this really should be a planful process, one that we have thought through. How are we going to provide support to our students and staff? Do we have enough staff to support the needs, or do we need to develop some referral processes with our community-based agencies? And we need to coordinate and collaborate on those.
And also reaching out to neighboring schools and just going ahead and saying, if heaven forbid this happens, we'd like to be able to, would you be able to spare 2 or 3 counselors or your school psychologist or your school social worker to be able to support and assist? And who would we need to call, if this was to happen? And going ahead and, like Martha's been saying, planning ahead and hoping that you never have to utilize this, but knowing that you already have that path of communication to get that support is huge.
Absolutely. And that is very common practice, to have your colleagues in other buildings to come out and support these schools, and as well as supporting the schools where maybe a sibling is attending. And maybe that sibling isn't in school, but maybe the friends of the sibling are hurting, and maybe they're in an elementary school, we wouldn't necessarily consider to be a high risk location, but in that situation it may be. So we need to really keep our eyes and ears open to any concerns that we're made aware of.
Absolutely.
And as we know, grief doesn't have a time frame on it. So we need to continue to monitor any kind of reactions and responses that we get from students and staff. We need to think about anniversaries, about maybe if, for example, if a student is a senior, maybe prom, graduation date, certain times that were relevant to that student or to the student's larger community. People are going to react differently and to different events. So just to be mindful that these could come up out of the blue sometimes when we're not even aware.
Absolutely. It's definitely not your monitoring doesn't end after the first week. It's
Right.
something that continue.
Absolutely. So when we talk about this continuum of exposure, we're talking about the suicide loss survivor and how they're affected. But this image kind of gives us an idea of what resources are we going to need to address student needs. So we look at our exposed, and those might be people who knew of the student in a sort of a tangential way. Maybe they were in a class, but they weren't really friends. Your affected youth are going to be those who maybe had direct contact or a friendship, or maybe they used to date the person who died. So there's going to be different groups, and each group is going to need a different level of response. Those in that long-term bereaved are very likely going to need more support and for a longer period of time. And that extends out from the circle. So that at the inner circle, that's going to be your longer term, more support, to the exposed that's very likely going to need lesser support and likely for a lesser amount of time.
Yeah, and it's important to not make assumptions of where a student's going to fall. You know, it might be a student that only, was in that class with that student, and you're thinking they didn't have much of a relationship, but because of other risk factors or other things that are happening in that student's life, that might push them into, further into that circle. So it's important for us to keep our mind open and not to make assumptions on where a student is going to fall, and being kind of aware of what symptoms they're showing and where they would fall on the spectrum.
So when we talk about memorializing a student, really it's a balancing act for our school personnel, particularly with our crisis team, because we want to balance that memorialization of the student with the risk of suicide contagion. And one way to address this is to really treat all memorials for student deaths the same way. So for example, a student who died of cancer or in a car accident versus a student who died by suicide might reinforce those prejudices associated with suicide, and also might be deeply painful to the student's family and friends. If everybody knows that when Johnny died of cancer last year, we planted a tree, but yet we're just going to ignore Joe's death by suicide, that's going to create a lot of additional stress for the family and friends. So again, we want to treat the memorials the same way for all student deaths. As far as funerals, we want to allow students to be able to attend funerals. It shouldn't be a celebration of let's close school, but we certainly want to allow students to attend the funeral, and we want to really encourage parents of students who want to attend with their student for additional support. We'd also recommend that at least one staff member attend the funeral, and it might be the person who had the best relationship with the student. But these are protocols that are really important to the family and important to the student population in showing some empathy towards the situation. Another thing that seems to happen quite frequently, particularly with death by suicide, is that students create spontaneous memorials. And this should be celebrated and encouraged, not created by staff, but also not taken away. You might want to put some time frames on it, that we're going to maybe keep this memorial out here for 2 weeks. And then those of you who contributed to it might want to take it, or we're going to share it with the family at the end of a certain time frame. But again, we don't want to inadvertently glamorize the death or make it look like it's a positive thing to other students. And as we've mentioned before, social media at this point can be a really effective tool in monitoring how students are reacting to the situation. And if there are ways that the school should pivot and react in somewhat different ways in order to better meet the student needs.
Mm-hmm. And one thing you can do with social media is, if you have a couple students who are leaders in the school community, pulling those students in and saying, look, we're all grieving right now and struggling with the loss of this classmate, and we want to make sure that we as school leaders keep ourselves tuned in to how students are reacting. So if you can let us know if you see something happening on social media, if there's a post out there that's inappropriate or concerning, please let us know so that we can address that. A lot of rumors and things like that also develop within social media. So having some students out there that can assist in that monitoring, and they know if I see something that is concerning or not appropriate or not accurate, here's who I should talk to at the school that can support and assist with dealing with that. So, I think we have to recognize that we aren't necessarily going to be able to monitor all of the social media out there, but we need to give our students the tools and the understanding of what to do if they see a concern.
And we've talked a little bit about messaging about death by suicide, and again, one of the first places that the crisis team is going to start is having that debrief or that communication with the school staff. And there are some great resources for how to promote a message of not only facts, but also really discussing what the school division is doing to promote prevention efforts and the resources available to those that require or need support. Media are always going to be hounding schools and school divisions whenever there is a death by suicide. Some of that is because of rumors that get created, but it's vital in this situation that there is an identified spokesperson, and that is going to be the only person that's going to share any communication with the media. We also don't want to hide from it. So we would encourage school divisions to make sure that you respond to social media or media requests and be available to answer questions. And messages should always promote a positive narrative that focuses on safety and what the school is doing to prevent future incidences and to keep students safe. And again, we talked about the planning piece. Planning for a suicide response really needs to be done ahead of time. You can see there's a lot involved when managing a suicidal event. And so you don't want to be caught in the event and trying to manage all of these pieces. It can be extremely challenging. But the school should really promote the strategies that are in place to address student needs and also ways to prevent future suicides.
So surprise, there's one more section. We threw this in here at the end just because we want to reiterate what we've said throughout these modules, is that this training should not be something that stands alone, that you as a risk assessment team need to come together and to do some of this planning outside of this training. And so here are some suggestions on some next steps on what that can look like. One thing is to do some resource mapping, and we've spoken to this a little bit already, but to go ahead and think about what's available in our community and what are our communication pathways with those folks. And if there's a need that you don't have, what can we do to develop that resource and to connect folks with it. And so there's a great needs assessment resource or mapping tool that you can use that we have linked here if you don't have one in place already. Another important thing to do is to do some scenario walkthroughs. And this is where you can either use scenarios that have happened in the past and talk about what went well and what could have been done differently, or you can find some scenarios, some sample scenarios, and talk through, okay, if this happened, who would do what, how would this work? Even role playing that student interview, it might feel silly or uncomfortable to do, but it's so important because it just, again, the first time you ask that question, you don't want it to be actually in the real setting. So doing those role plays when the stakes are low is so important, and it's the way that you can really prepare yourself as a professional to be who you need to be in those pivotal moments. So going through that is really important. But then also, scenario walkthroughs shouldn't be something that you just do at the beginning of the school year. Incorporating some organic times for your team to come together, to maybe do a refresher, to maybe debrief if you've had a couple scenarios that have happened, to talk about, what, this went really well, but this didn't. This was something that we didn't anticipate happening. How can we make sure that if it happens again, we're able to respond better? That's really important. So going ahead and taking your calendar out at the beginning of the school year and saying, we're going to meet again on this day to come together as a team to refine our practice, to refine our systems and our procedures. That's a great thing to go ahead and set in motion. And then these are a couple resources we created to help teams with their planning that we hope that you'll look into. The Suicide Risk Assessment Team Planning Guide and Checklist looks like this. And this is where you could just write down all the people that are on your team, their position, their cell phone and office numbers so that you're able to get in touch with them correctly. Having other important phone numbers available here for community agencies. Just having all of this in one place so that you can quickly access it and get to it, and keeping it in that folder or that binder that we've talked about is such a great thing to do and to have to streamline all of this. And then this is just kind of where you walk through all of the steps of what would happen in an intervention, and talking about who's going to do what, and just kind of making sure that everyone has a defined role and understanding on how this will flow in your school. And that goes all the way through that safety plan development. So it's a great resource to use to facilitate that conversation with your team and to start that planning process. So we hope that you'll look into that. And then we also have, hang on, the response procedures for a student at suicide risk. And I'm not going to pull that one up just for the sake of time, but that is also just another great resource that you can use to walk through and assess your team's protocols.
Are you done recording?
And then finally, we just want to close this out by, you gotta love working from home sometimes. Sorry about that, y'all. You've got to also think about just that preventive piece and that intervention piece, and every time we do things where we refine our practices as a team, where we put another preventive measure out there, where we get better at working together, we're really throwing another life preserver out into the ocean that's going to keep our kids safe. And so that's why I really love this image. because it just talks about the need for prevention is such a key. Suicide is a preventable death, and we have to keep that in mind. And we take such a large role in that in the school setting. And the more life preservers we can put out there, the more preventative work we can do, the safer our students will be. So thank you for all that you do in the schools to keep our students safe, to support our students. We appreciate you. We are here for you. And so please don't hesitate. I'm going to put this up again to reach out to myself or Martha if there's anything that we can do to support you in the work that you're doing. You know, that is, I can speak for myself and for Martha, I think, in this, and that's why we're here. That's why we took this job. We want to be there for you in this work. So please don't ever hesitate to reach out if we can be of support. Is there anything else you want to say, Martha, before we close it out?
I don't think so. You did a great job.
Great. Thank you all so much. Take care.
Thank you.